Our ancestors understood their bodies and their environment far better than we can imagine. They didn't have laboratories, but they had centuries of brutal, hands-on experience in survival. They knew how to build warm houses out of mud and sticks that stood for decades. They understood the principles of proper nutrition hundreds of years before the advent of trendy diet gurus on Instagram. And most importantly, they were capable of working in ways that modern humans are simply physically incapable of. Forget about rotten meat, poisoned water, and perpetually drunk people staggering through city streets. That image was invented by 19th century writers to sell their dramatic novels. The real Middle Ages were much cleaner, smarter, and more organized than what movies try to show us. We've all heard this popular historical fact that tour guides across Europe love to repeat. We're told that in the Middle Ages, the water was so dirty that drinking it was deadly. That's why absolutely everyone, from infants to the very elderly, supposedly spent their days guzzling ale or wine. It seems quite logical given the complete absence of modern water treatment facilities and chlorine in the water supply. It sounds as if all of Europe was in a state of constant intoxication for 1,000 years. But here lies the huge problem with this popular myth. If an entire civilization had drunk nothing but alcohol for centuries, it would simply have died out from chronic dehydration. Imagine a modern construction worker in the worst summer heat. Now imagine that instead of water, he drinks 2 liters of warm ale and goes off to haul stones. Sounds like a great and very quick way to end up in the nearest emergency room, doesn't it? Medieval peasants worked in the fields from dawn to dusk under the scorching sun, doing the hardest labor. They needed proper hydration just to avoid passing out right there in the cabbage patches. And they knew exactly where to get absolutely clean and safe water. Villages were always built near clean freshwater sources, springs, or deep, clear wells. People back then weren't idiots and fully understood the basic principles of natural sanitation. The monasteries of that time were true centers of cutting-edge engineering in the medieval world. They spent enormous sums on building complex water supply systems made of lead or high-quality wooden pipes. Why would they go to such lengths if everyone around them drank nothing but fermented grain? Because clean drinking water was always considered a gift from God and the foundation of human health. There were even strict laws strictly prohibiting the dumping of any waste into rivers upstream. But why then did they brew such a huge amount of ale every single day? And this is where things get really interesting from the perspective of modern nutritional science. Medieval ale was nothing like the strong craft beer we drink on Fridays. It was a very weak beverage with an alcohol content of about 1 or 2% at most. Essentially, it was just thick water with added nutritious grains. Given the conditions of hard physical labor, people desperately needed easily accessible and fast-acting carbohydrates. Weak ale served as an energy drink, providing the exhausted body with a huge boost of life-saving liquid calories. It was essentially an ancient Gatorade that helped peasants hold out until their evening meal. Modern athletes use sweet carbohydrate gels for the very same purposes during long marathons. Medieval people simply used liquid bread for this purpose, which they could take out into the fields. Moreover, the process of brewing ale involved mandatory and prolonged boiling of water. Modern science knows that boiling reliably kills most dangerous bacteria and harmful microorganisms. Peasants didn't know the word bacteria, but they clearly saw that people got sick less often from boiled drinks. It was a brilliant method for purifying questionable water, which they arrived at through long empirical observation. They solved the sanitation problem long before Louis Pasteur first looked through his microscope. In cities, the water situation was more complicated, but people there knew how to get by. Wealthy city dwellers collected clean rainwater in special sealed cisterns on the roofs of their brick houses. There was even a profession of water carrier, a person who brought clean spring water right to your doorstep. This was the medieval equivalent of modern water delivery in large plastic bottles for office water coolers. No one in their right mind would draw drinking water directly from dirty city drainage ditches. Medical treatises of the time, written by the best doctors, constantly advised drinking more clean water. They clearly distinguished between water from stagnant swamps, which was considered dangerous, and clean water from mountain springs. Doctors strongly recommended diluting wine with water to avoid severe intoxication and maintain a clear mind. This sounds nothing like the civilization of filthy drunkards we've grown accustomed to portraying them as. It was a pragmatic system of survival based on careful observation of nature and one's own body. So the next time someone tells you a tall tale about perpetually drunk nights, just smile. These people drank water from clean forest streams and used ale as fuel for their muscles. Modern nutritionists would call this a smart distribution of macronutrients throughout a hard day's work. Medieval laborers simply called it a regular Tuesday that had to be endured somehow, and they handled it far better than any of us would have in their place. The next popular myth makes modern people feel like incredibly young and healthy victors of evolution. We often hear alarming statistics claiming that the average life expectancy in the Middle Ages was around 30 years. From this fact, people conclude that a 30-year-old in the 13th century was considered a very old person. It seems to us that by this age, their teeth had fallen out, their hair had turned gray, and they were slowly preparing to die. This idea makes us rejoice in our anti-aging creams and modern health insurance. Cinema and popular literature only reinforce this bleak picture of the past in our minds. In movies, we constantly see filth, disease, and people who look like old men even as they approach their 30s. It is in directors' interest to show such exaggerations to create dramatic effect in a gloomy atmosphere of harsh times. Viewers readily believe this illusion, as it contrasts so sharply with our modern, comfortable world. However, historical reality was far more complex and interesting than these established stereotypes. Belief in this myth demonstrates not just a historical error, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how basic mathematical statistics work. 30 was never an age at which people dropped dead en masse from natural aging. This is an average figure, ruthlessly distorted by the incredibly high rate of infant mortality in those harsh times. In the Middle Ages, nearly half of all newborns simply did not survive to see their 10th day. Childhood diseases, which are now controlled by routine vaccinations, decimated entire villages at an alarming rate. A baby's first year of life was the greatest ordeal for any medieval family. A common cold, a mild intestinal infection, or a small scratch could prove fatal due to the lack of antibiotics in modern pediatrics. If a child survived infancy, measles, smallpox, and other harsh tests for a young immune system awaited them. Parents were well aware of these enormous risks, which is why statistics on early deaths relentlessly dragged the average life expectancy sharply downward. The death of a child was a tremendous tragedy, but it was a harsh reality of the time. Just think about this using a simple example from a basic high school math course. If one person dies at birth and another lives to be 60, their average age is exactly 30. Does this mean that a 60-year-old was some kind of impossible, magical exception to the general, strict rules? Absolutely not, because the elderly were a completely normal and respected part of any medieval urban or rural society. If you managed to survive the dangerous early years of childhood, your chances of a long life increase significantly and many times over. Modern archaeologists regularly examine bones in old medieval cemeteries throughout Europe. What they consistently find there, completely and irrevocably, debunks the myth of people dying of old age at 30. Most of the adult skeletons belong to men and women who live peacefully into their 50s, 60s, and sometimes even 70s. Moreover, these bones often exhibit a density and strength that any modern gym goer would envy. Their bodies were shaped by harsh environments and became highly reliable machines for survival. This incredible bone strength was a direct result of their daily and very hard physical labor. From a very young age, farmers and artisans grew accustomed to intense physical exertion outdoors in all kinds of weather. They chopped wood, carried water, plowed the land with heavy tools, and built houses with their own hands. This continuous work served as the best natural prevention against osteoporosis and many modern age-related diseases. Their skeletons simply had to be strong. Otherwise, a person would not have been physically able to feed their family. And here we logically arrive at a truly astonishing fact about the health of the average medieval adult. Historians have calculated that if you lived to the age of 21, your life expectancy was still about 40 years. In the society of that time, there were a huge number of sprightly 60-year-old farmers who went out to work in the fields every morning. They didn't have gym memberships or trendy trainers, but their daily routine was like an endless CrossFit workout. My joints start to creak in protest just at the thought of how much weight they lifted every single day. Of course, their lives were certainly not an ideal, carefree fairy tale about healthy, rosy-cheeked, eternal long livers. Serious infections from accidental cuts or complex bone fractures could easily send even the strongest adult man to his grave. But if you were lucky enough to avoid serious workplace injuries and devastating epidemics, you aged much the same way people age today. There were even special strict laws exempting men over 60 from mandatory military service and heavy taxes. Why did rulers need such laws if no one lived to that age anyway? The role of the elderly in such a society was incredibly important and deeply respected at all levels. The absence of the internet and printed books made the elderly the primary and sole custodians of valuable information and life experience. It was they who acted as justices of the peace in rural disputes, advised on the timing of sowing crops, and passed on the secrets of complex crafts. The younger generation listened very carefully to their words because the survival of the entire community often depended on this practical knowledge. Old age was then firmly associated with wisdom and authority, not with frailty and social isolation. It is particularly interesting to look at their teeth, because we are accustomed to the frightening image of peasants with black, rotten stumps in their mouths. You will be very surprised, but the teeth of a medieval peasant were often much healthier than those of the average person in the 19th century. The main reason lies in the fact that their strict and simple diet was almost entirely devoid of the worst enemy of tooth enamel. Refined white sugar was then a fabulously expensive exotic spice, available only to kings and very wealthy European merchants. Ordinary people simply could not afford to ruin their teeth with expensive sweet desserts. The average person's diet consisted of foods that required thorough and prolonged chewing. Peasants ate large amounts of coarse bread made from coarsely ground flour, hard root vegetables, seasonal cabbage, and various porridges. Such tough food not only provided the necessary energy, but also served as an excellent natural toothbrush. It effectively and mechanically cleaned the teeth of plaque with every meal, leaving no chance for severe tooth decay to develop. Therefore, strong teeth in the mouth of an elderly medieval miller were quite common and normal. In those days, there were even entire scientific treatises on caring for the elderly, written by renowned physicians. Doctors strongly recommended that the elderly get more rest, eat easily digestible warm food, and take regular walks in the fresh air. It is striking, but modern gerontologists give older people exactly the same basic recommendations for maintaining health and vitality. Ancient doctors understood perfectly well that aging is a natural process, requiring only a slight adjustment to one's usual rhythm of life. This clearly contradicts the image of a society that supposedly considered 30-year-olds to be decrepit and completely useless old people. If you think about it, a typical office job today requires far less physical effort than even the lightest medieval occupation. Yet it is precisely because of constantly sitting at a computer that many young people now complain of severe back pain as early as age 25. A medieval carpenter, well into his 50s, could easily lift a log that a modern city dweller couldn't even budge. Their phenomenal physical endurance lasted well into old age precisely because they never stopped being physically active. Modern sports trainers call this functional longevity, which we now so desperately and often unsuccessfully strive for. Therefore, the myth of 30-year-old old men reflects only our inability to correctly interpret and understand dry historical statistics. The Middle Ages were full of gray-haired grandmothers doting on their boisterous grandchildren and experienced grandfathers passing on the secrets of their ancient crafts. It was an absolutely normal, vibrant, and fulfilling society where old age was respected and considered a time of well-earned wisdom. Yes, the path to that old age was a cruel lottery in which only the strongest and luckiest infants survived. But those who did survive became true titans, forged from iron and sheer human stubbornness.
Finest grain in the county, right here.
5 shillings for the lot.
Let's discuss the smelliest historical stereotype that Hollywood loves to insert into every other historical film. It's believed that in the Middle Ages, people were terrified of water, considered washing a sin, and stank like an open sewer. We're shown shaggy peasants with faces blackened by dirt, scratching themselves for fleas right at the dinner table. The irony is that if you called a medieval person dirty, they'd be deeply offended, because in reality, people of that era were literally obsessed with the idea of bodily cleanliness and washing. Sounds crazy, right? But let's look at the real facts from the life of a typical 13th century European city. In Paris alone at that time, there were officially more than 30 large public bathhouses for residents. The bathhouse business was so profitable and respected that bathhouse owners formed powerful professional guilds. Townspeople didn't just visit these bathhouses once a year on holidays, but regularly, often several times a week. It was a favorite place for relaxation, gossip, and business negotiations, much like today's prestigious spas. But what about villagers who had no access to fashionable Parisian bathhouses? They managed just as well, using wooden tubs of hot water right in their own homes. If heating an entire bath was too expensive or time-consuming, people practiced daily washing with a sponge. Washing one's face, hands, and neck every morning was considered an absolutely essential routine for any decent person. Attending Sunday church services while dirty was seen as a sign of extreme disrespect toward God and one's neighbors. And this is where the most interesting part about their cleaning products begins. Products we know very little about. Peasants didn't just scrub themselves with their bare hands in cold water, hoping the dirt would wash off on its own. They mass-produced excellent natural soap using a mixture of animal fat and lye made from wood ash. It sounds like a strange recipe from a chemistry lab, but this soap was excellent at dissolving grease and washing away dirt. In many regions of Europe, soap production was a massive industry that exported its goods to neighboring countries. Moreover, people in the Middle Ages paid great attention to their body odor and the freshness of their clothes. They stored clean linens in chests lined with dried lavender, rose petals, and fragrant herbs. Bad breath or body odor was considered a serious social flaw, worthy of public ridicule. There were even special etiquette guides that strictly prescribed washing one's hands before every meal. And this was critically important in an era when people ate most dishes with their hands from shared plates. The church, which is often accused of promoting uncleanliness, actually actively promoted hygiene. Many monasteries were the first to build running water systems and create elaborate bathing facilities for monks. Yes, some ascetic monks refused to wash in order to prove their holiness through voluntary bodily suffering. But this was considered an extreme feat precisely because everyone else, normal people, washed regularly. If everyone around them had been walking around dirty, there would have been no holy sacrifice in refusing to bathe. It's amusing to watch modern people buying expensive scrubs with charcoal or natural clay in trendy boutiques. Medieval people would have mixed this with ash and called it ordinary cheap soap for washing coarse tunics. They used sand and coarse grasses to scrub heavy dirt off their hands after hard work in the fields. The modern beauty industry simply takes ancient recipes, packages them in plastic, and sells them to us for 100 times the price. We're reinventing the wheel, thinking we've come up with something incredibly innovative and beneficial for the skin. The myth of total filth emerged much later, during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, for a very specific reason. In the 16th century, new waves of disease swept across Europe, and doctors mistakenly concluded that hot water opened pores to infection. It was then, not in the Middle Ages, that many European aristocrats actually stopped bathing regularly. Writers of the Enlightenment looked at this horror and, for some reason, blamed the preceding medieval era for everything. Thus, the Middle Ages undeservedly earned the reputation of being the dirtiest and smelliest period in human history. A real medieval peasant, finding himself in a modern, crowded subway car during rush hour, would most likely cover his nose with his hand. The smell of sweat and cheap deodorant would seem just as unpleasant to him as it does to us. Their hygiene standards were different, but the desire to be clean is a basic human need in any era. They survived in a harsh world precisely because they washed away dirt and bacteria without even knowing the word microbiology, and they did so regularly, with pleasure, and with the help of excellent homemade soap. Let's talk about food, because our ideas about medieval cuisine are a complete nightmare. The movies have firmly planted in our minds the image of perpetually hungry people subsisting on scraps. For some reason, we think that wealthy kings ate nothing but huge portions of fatty roasted meat, and the poor, oppressed peasants chewed on dry crusts and rotten raw turnips every day. This picture seems logical to us, since we're used to thinking of the Middle Ages as an era of total decline. But the real history of cooking from that time is very different from Hollywood fantasies. In popular culture, it's believed that spices cost a fortune just to mask the rotten smell. Supposedly, cooks would sprinkle precious pepper to cover up the disgusting taste of long-rotten pork. But let's apply some simple logic and think about people engaged in hard physical labor. If you really fed strong, hard-working laborers spoiled food, they would simply have died out. In reality, their diet was incredibly well thought out and expertly balanced. Modern nutritionists could easily write complex scientific dissertations about it. Let's begin our journey into history with the most famous peasant dish. It was a thick stew, which in Old English was proudly called pottage. To modern ears, this sounds like a boring, gray slop eaten by sad prisoners in dungeons. But the historical reality was quite different and far more appetizing. At its core, it was a thick, hearty porridge or a very filling stew. This dish simmered slowly over low heat in a large cauldron for practically the entire day. The recipe for this stew was never strict and varied depending on the season. Whole grains, legumes, fresh cabbage, onions, and garlic were generously added to it. Any available seasonal vegetables, harvested by peasants straight from their small gardens, were also thrown in. The result was an incredibly thick and aromatic broth, so thick that a wooden spoon would literally stand upright in it. It was a true medieval superfood, accessible to absolutely every worker. It was incredibly rich in complex carbohydrates, plant protein, and very beneficial fiber. Modern trendy nutritionists constantly harp on the same idea from our TV screens. They say we need to eat more whole grains and significantly less processed meat. Doctors strongly recommend macrobiotic diets for longevity and cleansing the body. The problem is that such dietary products cost a fortune in specialty health food stores. Yet the average medieval peasant followed this ultra-trendy diet every single day. And he did so simply because these were the only simple foods available to him. In those distant times, meat was indeed a rather rare and expensive treat for common folk. That's why they rarely ate it in huge chunks, as modern steak lovers do. Most often, meat was used as a strong flavor enhancer for the main dish. The housewife would simply toss a small piece of salted bacon into a huge pot of stew for flavor. This provided the working man with an absolutely ideal nutritional balance for hard labor. He got maximum energy from grains and just enough animal fat to get through a cold day. But what about that very popular story about masking spoiled food? I'm referring to the myth that spices supposedly hid the taste of rotten and spoiled meat. This is perhaps the silliest and most illogical culinary tall tale that modern people could have come up with. In those days, spices were brought from distant Asia by caravans through many dangerous countries. Seasoning such as black pepper, fragrant cloves, or cinnamon were fabulously expensive in the markets. They were literally valued as highly as pure gold and were a sign of incredible luxury. A small pinch of truly good pepper could cost more than an entire live cow. Sometimes a small bag of spices could even buy a huge carcass of a healthy pig. Now let's think about common sense and the simple economics of that time. Why would a wealthy lord sprinkle rotten, cheap meat with an incredibly expensive exotic spice? After all, for that same huge sum of money, he could simply buy a whole herd of fresh, high-quality meat. The truth is that medieval people were true geniuses of survival. They became unrivaled masters of food preservation long before the advent of electric refrigerators. Our ancestors salted, smoked, air-dried, and skillfully marinated meat and caught fish. They did this so effectively that food supplies lasted through long winters without the slightest spoilage. The ability to properly salt pork was a matter of life and death for the entire peasant family. Therefore, food preservation techniques were honed over centuries and worked flawlessly. Moreover, medieval cities had very strict food quality control laws. Special guilds and armed city guards closely monitored the markets. Unscrupulous butchers who sold poor quality meat were publicly punished in the town square and severely fined. No mayor wanted to allow mass food poisoning or an epidemic in his densely populated city. Therefore, the freshness and quality of food on market stalls were monitored very strictly. If you bought salted herring, it was just as safe as canned goods in your supermarket. It's also very interesting to note how our ancestors viewed common vegetables and fresh greens. After all, most of these vitamin-rich plants often grew right in their backyards, under their windows. Today, we're used to making trendy, sweet green smoothies in an electric blender. We drink them to get our daily dose of vitamins and beneficial micronutrients. But medieval people got those same vitamins from huge amounts of plain cabbage. They actively ate carrots, parsnips, and plenty of fresh greens, which they simply gathered in the woods. People of the past intuitively and very clearly understood one important rule of healthy eating. They knew that a person's diet must be strictly seasonal. Their diet was perfectly attuned to nature's rhythms and the changing seasons. During the cold winter, they ate hearty root vegetables, thick porridges, and various pickles from wooden barrels. And in the warm summer, they quickly switched to fresh greens, seasonal vegetables, and wild berries. This natural approach to food worked perfectly, helping people maintain an ideal and strong immune system. Of course, we shouldn't idealize the past or forget the dark chapters of history. Yes, they experienced periods of terrible famine due to sudden crop failures or harsh weather conditions. Sometimes long, protracted wars devastated entire regions, depriving people of their last grain reserves. This is a historically confirmed and completely indisputable fact that brought great suffering to ordinary families. But in normal, calm, and peaceful years, their peasant diet was excellent. It was hundreds of times healthier than our beloved modern fast food and frozen convenience foods. Take bread, for example, which was the mainstay of the entire medieval diet. Their bread was coarse, dark, very dense, and full of healthy cereal bran. It was exactly the kind of artisanal product that is now sold in upscale bakeries for a fortune. Only the very wealthy and noble ate soft, white, refined bread. The irony is that it was precisely these wealthy people who most often suffered from digestive problems and gout. Meanwhile, the common poor, without even realizing it, ate food that kept their digestive systems running like a well-oiled Swiss clock. Dairy products also played a huge and vital role in their daily diet. This was especially true of hard cheeses, whose recipes had been carefully perfected over centuries. The main value of such cheese was that it could be stored for months without any refrigeration. It was an excellent and very reliable source of calcium and concentrated animal protein. Shepherds and travelers always took large chunks of this cheese with them to distant pastures and on long journeys. This product did not spoil in intense heat and provided a very long-lasting feeling of fullness. Essentially, this hard cheese served as a substitute for modern sports supplements. These were the true natural protein bars of the harsh Middle Ages. The only difference was that they were made from real fresh milk, not soy powder and artificial chemicals. Peasants often ate this cheese with a whole head of pungent garlic or bitter onions. In this simple way, they provided themselves with powerful antibacterial protection against infections. This was the diet of professional survivalists, developed through the long trial and error of many generations. That's why we should reconsider our condescending attitude toward the culinary traditions of the past. The next time you're on the go, eating your sweet, low-fat yogurt, pause for a second. Or when you're chewing on a tasteless, wilted salad from a plastic store container, just think about it. Your tired body would most likely thank you profusely and sincerely for a different meal. It would definitely prefer a bowl of that very thick medieval peasant stew with beans and a chunk of bacon. Medieval people endured incredible physical exertion every single day. They marched for hours on end and built massive stone castles by hand, clearly not on an empty stomach. Our ancestors fueled their bodies with high-quality, natural, and slow-burning fuel. This simple food gave them tremendous and, most importantly, steady energy for the entire hard work day. It was the true science of proper nutrition, and it existed in its purest, most practical, and most effective original form. If there is one area where we are absolutely certain of our superiority over our ancestors, it is medicine. It seems to us that a medieval doctor was simply a butcher who would bleed patients for any reason and pray. We are convinced that any cut on a finger inevitably led to gangrene, amputation, and a painful death in agony. It seems that their entire system of treatment boiled down to plantain and strange dances around the patient with a tambourine. But when modern scholars finally set about translating ancient medical treatises, they were in for a real shock. One of the most striking examples is an Old English manuscript from the 10th century known as Bald's Book of Leeches. It describes a remedy for an eye infection that is known today as Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA. The recipe called for mixing garlic, leeks, wine, and cow bile, then letting it all sit in a copper vessel. Sounds like a disgusting salad dressing concocted by a witch in a forest hut, doesn't it? However, scientists at the University of Nottingham decided to recreate this ancient recipe in their modern laboratory. And this is where the most interesting part begins. It left the microbiologists literally speechless with amazement. This crazy medieval concoction killed 90% of antibiotic-resistant Staphylococcus bacteria. It turned out to be almost as effective as the modern synthetic antibiotic vancomycin. Moreover, neither garlic, nor wine, nor bile alone produced such a powerful therapeutic effect. Only the precise combination of these ingredients, aged in copper, triggered a complex chemical reaction that destroyed the infection. How did 10th century peasants, who knew nothing of the existence of bacteria, manage to create a complex multi-component antibiotic? The answer is simple: a brutal and merciless method of millennia of trial and error. If the ointment killed the patient, the recipe was discarded. If the person miraculously survived, the ointment was recorded in a book. They did not understand the mechanism of action at the cellular level, but they clearly saw the final practical result. This is pure empirical scientific method in action, disguised as old wives' superstitions and fairy tales. Many methods of treating wounds on the battlefield also turned out to be alarmingly correct from the perspective of modern surgery. Doctors often rinsed soldiers' deep wounds with wine or strong vinegar before applying a tight bandage. Wine contains alcohol and acids, which are excellent natural antiseptics that inhibit bacterial growth. Sometimes pure honey was applied to the wound, and honey, as we now know for certain, has a powerful osmotic antibacterial effect. It literally draws moisture out of bacteria, giving the infection no chance to develop or multiply. Surgery was also not the blind and bloody horror that it is often portrayed in gory TV shows. Medieval surgeons were able to perform successful trepanations of the skull, remove arrows from the chest, and treat complex hernias. They had special instruments for widening wounds and special sponges soaked in opium and mandrake. This so-called sleep sponge was applied to the patient's face and acted as a primitive but effective general anesthetic. Yes, the risks were enormous, but this was clearly not on the level of cave dwellers with stone axes. It's funny that even their most criticized practice, bloodletting, had a certain logical basis. Doctors believed that the body's fluid balance needed to be restored, which of course sounds unscientific now. But in cases of high blood pressure or pulmonary edema, removing some blood could indeed temporarily relieve symptoms. It was a desperate measure that sometimes worked, which is why it remained in doctors' arsenals for so long. They weren't sadists. They were simply using the limited set of tools they had. So the next time you scratch your finger and rush to the pharmacy for expensive antibacterial ointment, remember this: your ancestors survived in a world of flying arrows, rusty nails, and axes with the help of onions, wine, and cow bile. They found active chemical compounds in nature and created medicines that are being tested today in state-of-the-art laboratories. Their medicine was harsh, strange-looking, but incredibly practical and focused on real results. They deserve our respect, not condescending mockery of their ignorance. Summing up our brief historical investigation, we can draw one very important and sobering conclusion. We are accustomed to viewing history as a straight line, where we stand at the very pinnacle of development, and the past is simply darkness. It seems to us that any technology of the past is, by default, more primitive and less sophisticated than our modern brilliant gadgets. But the Middle Ages proved the opposite. Human ingenuity is capable of working wonders under the most extreme conditions. These people built a complex, functioning survival system out of the limited materials they had at their disposal. Just think about it again. They weren't dirty, perpetually drunk savages with rotten teeth. They drank clean water, washed with excellent soap, ate a balanced organic diet, and treated themselves with the most powerful natural antibiotics. Their bodies were trained machines capable of withstanding stresses that would simply break a modern person in two. Your back aches after 8 hours of sitting in a comfortable chair in front of a brand new monitor. Their backs withstood decades of hard physical labor without expensive massage therapists or chiropractors. Yes, their world was incredibly harsh, and the slightest mistake or a bad cut could cost them their lives. They didn't have the internet to Google their symptoms or an ambulance that would arrive in 10 minutes. But it was precisely this harshness that forced them to be extremely attentive to their surroundings and their physical condition. They intuitively understood the laws of nature, which modern science is only now beginning to rediscover through complex research. In essence, they were practicing biohacking and macrobiotics 1,000 years before we came up with the trendy terms for them. So the next time you see a grubby peasant chewing dirt in a movie, just smile at the absurdity of it. You now know the truth, which is far more complex, interesting, and respectful of our ancestors. They passed their genes down to us precisely because they were the smartest and most adaptable survivors on the planet. And honestly, if a global collapse were to happen, their skills would prove far more useful than our ability to give presentations. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Stay curious and never believe popular historical myths.